Christophe could feel himself responding to the closeness of this intriguing woman. What would she feel like, he wondered. He couldn't help imagining that loving her would be the most erotic experience of his life. Clearly, having Erica and him in the same room was another of her little games, designed to see just how many hoops she could make us both jump through. He glanced over at her, taking in the excitement that seemed to fizz through her, the laughter that bubbled into the conversation. There was a clear end game here, and he could easily imagine what it was. Well, maybe he had a game of his own to play this time. It all seemed to be going so well. Erica and Christophe were getting on just as she had hoped. She had watched him, taking in the surprise that had immediately been followed by the speculative look that she knew so well from her own experience with him. And Erica seemed to be making her own running, relishing the attention of them both and enjoying the flirtation. She had been sure that this evening would be a success, and now she was certain of it. The table was small enough so that each of them could hand the other a plate or a serving spoon. The dinner was informal, so that there were few absences from the table, and plenty of time for the pleasure of simple food cooked well, and good conversation delivered by three people who all knew the subtext, but were only willing at this stage to deliver the expected speech. At first, she knew that her little game was going to be played out according to the rules she had set. She was controlling the conversation, enjoying the sparring between the other two, and relishing the role of referee. But then it seemed to delicately, almost unnoticeably, slide out of her orbit, so that the structure of the table and the evening subtly shifted away from her. It was disconcerting and then alarming as she realized that what had begun as an exercise in her control over others had become instead an exercise in self-control as others maneuvered around her. He had assumed that Erica was just another game for her. He assumed that, like him, she was another tool that she would use and then discard when the job was done. That implied a certain passivity that he had certainly despised in himself, but that he thought Erica probably relished, a bottom to her top. But after they had sat down at dinner, he had felt her toes under the table, and had watched her eyes as they met his, and seemed to embrace him in their own little intrigues. His mind had darted ahead, seeking the possibilities and relishing the opportunities. This was a scenario that had no certain outcome, and he had realized that not only could he have a critical impact, but that Erica wanted him to do so. As he thought about the opportunities, the more he liked the ones that implied a more assertive role for himself. With Erica's support, there was no need for any more passivity. On the contrary, he could move with her to control his own destiny and, at the same time, rid himself of the malaise that had affected him. When it came, the end was horribly sudden. She had watched the evening unfold, increasingly certain that her control had slipped away, but still hopeful that there would be an ending that she could salvage. She had been about to pour coffee when Christophe had simply stood up from the table and moved around until he stood behind Erica's chair. He drew her chair out, helped her to her feet, and then, with a single, sly, backwards glance, had walked to the door, opened it, and stepped out into the night. It had been the ultimate act of defiance by both of them, a gesture that showed her it was they and not her who was in control of their relationships. For a while, she sat alone at the table, surrounded by the detritus of the meal, her fingers idly toying with the knife that she had been using to cut the cheese. She supposed that this changed everything. No more Christophe and no more Erica. Well, then again, perhaps Christophe and Erica would be back, but with a different dynamic to offer. She toyed with that thought for a moment and then discarded it. No, she had fought long and hard to drag herself back from the precipice, and now she was at last on solid ground. So they had left, but she still controlled her own destiny. She put down the knife and pushed herself up and away from the table. She walked out of the dining room and back down the flagstone passage, feeling once again the cool of the floor against the warmth of her feet. Back now in the room, she looked sideways for reassurance at the mirror, which confirmed she was who she thought she was, a woman unchanged from the events of this evening. She picked up the knife and drew the blade across the flesh that now lay in her palm. She paused for a moment, relishing the anticipation, savouring what was to come. Then, the decision taken, she made a quick downward movement of the blade, and the skin peeled away from the flesh in a pink, curling curve to drop softly on the hard floor. Another quick movement, and another piece fell. Then she was ready. Her hand moved toward her mouth, her lips enfolded the flesh, and her teeth bore down to bite through. Her eyes closed in a moment of ecstasy, and then the juices from the peach filled her mouth and throat, the nectar overwhelming her senses. She swallowed eagerly, capturing the essence, her tongue moving swiftly to contain the juices that tried to escape down her chin. It was a moment to savor, to treasure.